Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirla Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likkutei Sichos, Chelek Tetzave, Parshas Tetzave, Sicha Aleph. And the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha, we learned a pasuk that speaks about the Me'il that the Kohen Gadol wears. And this pasuk speaks about the opening at the top of the Me'il where the Kohen Gadol puts his head through. It says over there, V'haya pireisha b'seichai. The top of it should be folded inwards. Safa yelepiv saviv maisa erig. All around there should be a hem, which is done through weaving. Kifi sachar yiyalei. It should be like the opening of a coat of armor. Lo yikareya. It should not tear. And we learned the teaching of Rashi on this pasuk. And there are 4 parts in the Sikha. The Rebbe will, number 1, ask 3 questions on Rashi. Number 2, present the key to answering these questions. Number 3, answer the 3 questions on Rashi. And number 4, present the Inyanim Muflaim and Halacha and the Yena Shel Torah in our Rashi. The pasuk says by the tzivui, by the command of a sisas mila ephod, the command of making the me'il for the Kohen Gadol. So the pasuk says about the opening where the Kohen Gadol puts his head through at the top, that safa yilapiv saviv maisa erig. There should be a hem by that opening all the way around. It should be done through weaving. Kifi sachra yilei. It should be like the opening of a coat of armor. Lo yikareya. So Rashi quotes the words lo yikareya, and he explains kidei shelo yikareya. This is an order that it should not tear. Then Rashi continues and says, V'hakairei oiver balav, and someone who does tear the me'il transgresses a lav, an avera. And then Rashi continues further with his explanation, as we'll see later in the Sikha, but first we'll stop over here and ask a question on this part of Rashi. And as we'll see, there are actually 3 questions on this Rashi, but there's only one on this first part. So the first of these 3 questions is, from this that Rashi says, Kidei shelo yikareya, that all of this is done in order that it shouldn't tear. So we see that Rashi learns that when the pasuk says lo yikareya, it isn't a command for itself. We don't read it as the Torah telling us 2 things. Number 1, safa yilapiv, you should make this hem. And number 2, the Torah is telling us an loisasa, an avera, lo yikareya, don't tear it. But from this that Rashi says, kidei shelo yikareya, so we see that he learns that when it says lo yikareya, it isn't a command for itself, but rather it's a reason and an explanation for what it says beforehand. Why safa yilapiv? Kifi sachra, why make this hem? Lo yikareya, in order that it shouldn't tear. And so there's a difficulty over here. If that's the case, that Rashi is learning it, that lo yikareya comes in continuation to what it says beforehand, and it's not an avera for itself, so how does Rashi say in continuation to these very words, and with a vav ha'meisif, like it's one continuation, one thing connected to the next, v'hakairei over balav, which means that lo yikareya is a lav for itself. It seems that there's only one of 2 ways of reading the pasuk. Either lo yikareya comes in continuation to what it says beforehand, and it comes as an explanation for why they make the hem, or it's a command for itself. Don't tear the me'il. And Rashi over here brings both of them in one continuation. And this is especially difficult based on what the Gemara says. In short, what the Gemara says is, there's 2 opinions. One opinion over there says that someone who tears the big kahuna gets malchus, because it says in the pasuk, lo yikareya. The other one then challenges this explanation and says, maybe the pasuk is not saying an avera here of lo yikareya, a lav, not to tear it, but rather it's giving an explanation for what it says beforehand. Why make the hem? Kidei shelo yikareya, in order that it doesn't tear. And that first opinion then responds, does it say in the pasuk shelo yikareya? If it meant to say that it's a reason for what it says beforehand, when it says lo yikareya, it's the explanation for why they make the hem, it's in order that it shouldn't tear, then the pasuk should have said shelo yikareya. So what do we see from here? That translating lo yikareya to mean kidei shelo yikareya, in order that it shouldn't tear, is a contradiction to saying that it's an avera for itself. Because that was a challenge. Who said it's an avera? Maybe it's only saying a reason and explanation, meaning that if it is saying a reason and an explanation, then it's not an avera. It's not a tzivui for itself. So it's one or the other. And that's actually the reason that we indeed find in the Mefarshei Torah 2 different opinions. on how to learn these words, whether lo yikareya is just a reason for what it says beforehand, or whether it's a lav for itself. So it's a wonder over here. How does Rashi bring these two opposing explanations in one explanation and in continuation to one another? Afterwards, Rashi continues and explains, Shezem minyan lavin shed betera, because this is one of the lavin, one of the total number of lavin in the Torah. V'chein v'leizach ha'chayshin, and so too when the pasuk says that the chayshin should not move off of the ephod, that too is a lav. V'chein le'yusur mimenu, and so too when it says that they should not be removed from it, talking about hanem or rebadei aron, that's said about the poles in the aron, that too is from the lavin in the Torah. And on this section in Rashi, there are two questions. So we're up to the second question in the Sikha. So simply, when we look at the words Shazem Minyan Lav and Shabbatera, so it seems that they are a proof that Lo Yikareh as a Lav. Rashi is saying, how do we know Va'kereh Eiver B'Lav? How do we know that it's a Lav? Shazem Minyan Lav and Shabbatera, because it's one of the number of the total number of Lavin that there are in the Torah. So it must be saying Lo Yikareh as a Lav. And Rashi is saying this is the proof, even though the pasuk seems to be saying not that it's a lav, but rather kedei lo yikareya, that it's an explanation and a reason for what it says beforehand. And that's indeed why Rashi says first kedei lo yikareya, because that's the simple meaning. But then Rashi continues and says a second meaning, va'kerei over belav, someone who tears it transgresses a lav. Why are we saying the second thing as well? Because this is one of the lavin in the Torah, so it must be saying over here that it's a lav. Now, the difficulty with this is that Rashi is based on Pshuta Shemikra. And so from where does Rashi know in Pshuta Shemikra that it's a lav? What's the proof? Because it's one of the lavin. In Pshuta Shemikra, where do we know that this is a lav? It has to be based on Pshuta Shemikra, it's a lav, and then we could use it as a proof. But in Pshuta Shemikra, how do we know that this is a lav? And even though the idea that there are a number of mitzvahs is known in Pshuta Shemikra, Rashi already told us that there is a certain number of mitzvahs, but we still have the question, because from where do we know that lo yikareya is one of those mitzvahs? And so if we don't know it in Pshuta Shemikra, then it can't be used as a proof. And the third question is, and this is a much greater question, on the end, where Rashi says, V'chein v'layizach ha'chayshin, v'chein la'yusur mimenu hanemar bebadei ha'aron. When it says la'yizach ha'chayshin and la'yusur mimenu. So this is even more difficult. Mefarshim say that these are examples of where it can mean both a reason and a lav. That when it's saying v'la yizach, it's both a reason for what it says beforehand and a lav, not to move the chayshin from the ephod. And so too when it says lo yusuru, it's an explanation for what it says beforehand, as well as a lav for itself. And it's not understood. Because in addition to our previous question, that how do we know in Pshuta Shemikra that these are lavin, the difficulty is that Rashi doesn't say anything on those psukim. Rashi doesn't tell us on those psukim when it says v'lo yizach and lo yasuru that they're both a reason and a lav. And so memanavshach, if there's a difficulty in saying that it means two things, and that's why Rashi has to give his whole explanation over here, so then say something over there. On those psukim which were said earlier, Rashi should have said something. V'lo yizach, he should have told us it's both a reason and a lav. Lo yasuru, it's both a reason and a lav. And if not, if it's not difficult to say this, and to the extent that Rashi doesn't have to say anything whatsoever, and he takes it simply that we'll learn those psukim, v'lo yizach, both as a reason and a lav, lo yusuru as a reason and a lav, so then Rashi shouldn't say anything over here either, because it's something which is so simple and obvious that Rashi didn't have to say anything about it over there. So now, regarding the first question, that how can lo yikareya be both a reason and a lav? So Mefarshim answer that according to Pshuta Shemikra, when we read the pasuk simply, lo yikareya, and so too when it says v'lo yizach and lo yasuru, it's not a lav, but rather it's a reason. So the simple way of reading the pasuk is make the hem lo yikareya kedei lo yikareya. However, if it only meant a reason, then it should have said Shelo Yikareya, as the Gemara indeed asks. If it's a reason, it should say Shelo Yikareya. And since it says Lo Yikareya, and not Shelo Yikareya, so we must say that the Torah means to say two things. Number one, the simple meaning that it's Kedei Shelo Yikareya. And number two, since it's written lo yikareya and not shel lo yikareya, there must be another teaching in that, and that is that it's a lav. However, the issue is that the third question still remains, which is if we're going to learn that lo yikareya and also v'lo yizach and lo yasuru are both a reason and a lav, and the explanation is because the simple meaning is that it's a reason. And since it doesn't say shelo yikareya, and so too shelo yizach and shelo yasuru, therefore we learn that it must be saying another thing, which is that it's a lav. So then Rashi should have said that on those psukim which come earlier, on v'lo yizach and lo yasuru, Rashi should have given the explanation that he gives here. It's shelo yizach and shelo yasuru, and also that they are a lav. So that's the difficulty that remains according to this answer. So now we're going to move on to the key to answering these questions. And already in the key, we're going to answer the third question. We're already over here going to understand why it is that even though over here Rashi explains the words lo yikareya, nevertheless he doesn't explain anything. He doesn't say anything on the words earlier v'lo yizach and lo yasuru. So that already is going to be answered. The part of the third question that won't be answered yet is what is the meaning of these words in Rashi when he says v'chein v'lo yizach ha'choshen v'chein lo yasuru mimenu anemar bebadei ha'oren, because as we'll see, the Rebbe learns them differently than the way we explained them beforehand. Now the key in the sikh over here is different than it is in many other sikhs. Over here the key is to understand what's the right way in pshat of learning this pasuk. How are we supposed to learn this pasuk correctly in pshat without Rashi, and then based on that to understand the first thing that Rashi says as a result of that understanding that we're going to have in Pshat. And once we understand that, what's the right way of learning this pasuk? And the first thing that Rashi says on the pasuk, then it's going to lead into answering all the questions that we had on Rashi. So the explanation on this is as follows. According to Pshat, we should say that v'lo yizach and lo yasuru are not a reason and an explanation. This is different than the Mefarshim. The other Mefarshim said that when we look at these words, we say they're a reason and an explanation. And it's just since it says v'lo yizach and lo yasuru and not shelo yizach and not shelo yasuru, so we learn that it's also a lav. The Rebbe is saying over here that according to Pshat, we should say that v'lo yizach and lo yasuru are not the reason and an explanation, but rather they are a command and a lav for themselves. Because as we said earlier, if it's a reason, then it should have said shelo yizach and shelo yasuru, as the Gemara asks. So because of that question, actually the simple way in Pshat is to learn that they are a lav for themselves. And even though it doesn't say lo taziach and lo tasirim, which lo taziach and lo tasirim mean a command to the person. It's telling the person lo taziach, lo tasirim. But rather it says shelo yizach and shelo yasuru, which shelo yizach and shelo yasuru mean that the choshen should not become loose from the ephod, and the badim should not be removed from the rings. It's not saying a command to the person. Nevertheless, it can still be explained as a command, because it's saying that the person should do whatever can be done so that the choshen should not become loose from the ephod, and the badim should not be removed from the rings. When it says in the pasuk v'lo yizach, it should not become loose. It's telling the person, do whatever needs to be done so that it shouldn't become loose. Lo yasuru, they shouldn't be removed. It's telling the person, do whatever needs to be done so that they shouldn't be removed. And like it says right before, by the Aron, right before lo yasuru, it says, b'tabayis ha'aron yu abadim, that the badim should be in the rings. It's telling the person to do what needs to be done so that they should be in the rings. So even though it's saying you, they should be, but it's a command to the person, do what needs to be done so that they should be in the rings. So that's the simple way of learning those psukim, and so that answers our third question. How come Rashi doesn't say anything over there? There's no need to say anything. You read the psukim and you understand very simply. V'lo yizach, there's a command over here that the person should do whatever needs to be done so that the choshen shouldn't become loose from the ephod. It says lo yasuru. It's a command. It's telling the person, do whatever needs to be done so that the badim should not be removed from the rings. However, there's a change in our pasuk where it says lo yikareya. It doesn't say the equivalent of v'lo yizach and lo yasuru is not lo yikareya. It's lo yikara. Now in our pasuk it says lo yikareya. So if it means the same thing as v'lo yizach and lo yasuru, that it's a command, so then there must be something that's being added here. It's not just lo yizach and lo yasuru, which then would be lo yikara. It's a command, but what type of command? A command of lo yikareya. And like Rashi says on Kol Malacha Lo Ye'aseh Vahem, Rashi says, what's the added thing of Ye'aseh? Even even through others. So if we're going to say Lo Yikareya as a command, we have to say something's being added by the usage of the word Yikareya, and which is that it shouldn't be done even through others. It shouldn't be ripped even through others, which means then that by V'lo Yizach and Lo Yasuru, and all other warnings, Hazaras, by the Mishkan and its Kalim, where it doesn't use the type of lashon of Yikareya, it doesn't matter if it's done through others. That's how we're going to have to learn it. Here is Lo Yikareya afilu al yedei acherim, even through others. Over there, it's just Lo Yizach yourself, but through others, it's fine. Which that doesn't make any sense in the approach of Pshat, to say it doesn't matter if it's done through others. So that's how we learn this pasuk, and that's why Rashi here has to give an explanation. We're looking at this pasuk, and we have a difficulty. We're going to learn Lo Yikareya, that it's a command. And so that means Lo Yikareya, even through others, and the other ones could be done through others. And therefore Rashi explains that it means Kedei Shelo Yikareya. The reason for the change in the wording, from instead of saying Lo Yikara, it says Lo Yikareya. So the reason for the change in the wording here is because it's a reason for what's written beforehand. It's not a command, it's a reason. So that's the correct way of learning the pasuk, which then brings this question, what does Lo Yikareya mean? And the explanation of Rashi. Rashi tells us Lo Yikareya means Kedei Shelo Yikareya, because otherwise we'll have this difficulty. And with this in place, we're going to lead into answering the questions. The answer to the first question, which was, how can Lo Yikareya be both a reason and a lav? So let's see what Rashi says. Rashi says, when it says Lo Yikareya, it means Kedei Shelo Yikareya. However, since it doesn't say Shelo Yikareya, but rather it says Lo Yikareya, so this proves that there's also a separate command and lav for itself, which is that the person shouldn't tear the me'il. So the way we understand this pasuk is when we look at it simply, it should be a lav, but there's a great difficulty with that, because then it would mean only this one can be done through others. The others could be done through others. That's a very big problem. So Rashi tells us, when it says Lo Yikareya, it means Kedei Shelo Yikareya. And that's why it says it in a way of Yikareya. However, if it meant only that, if that's all the Torah meant to say, it would have said Shelo Yikareya. And since it doesn't say Shelo Yikareya, so it proves that there's another teaching over here the pasuk's telling us, which is Lo Yikareya. There's a lav over here to the person as well. Now we're going to move on to answer the second question. The truth is the second question is already answered, because the second question was, we learned that the words Shazem Minin Lav and Shabbatera mean that we have a proof that Lo Yikareya is a lav, because it's one of the lavin in the Torah, so it must be Lo Yikareya means a lav. But according to what we're learning now, the way we know that Lo Yikareya is a lav is because if it only meant Kedei Shelo Yikareya, it would have said Shelo Yikareya. Since it doesn't say Shelo Yikareya, we learned that it's a lav. So the words Shazem Minin Lav and Shabbatera is not a proof. So really what needs to be explained now is, what is Rashi saying? Rashi should have stopped here. Rashi tells us, and since it says Lo Yikareya, not Lo Yikara, it means Kedei Shelo Yikareya. Then why does it say Lo Yikareya, not Shelo Yikareya? So it says, because Akere over Belav, it's telling us also that it's a lav. So what's the next part of Rashi? So when we're up to this point in Rashi, there's still more that needs to be said. Because however, it's still difficult. Even when we're at this point, we learned that it means Kedei Shelo Yikareya. And why does it say Lo Yikareya, not Shelo Yikareya? Because it's a lav. But there's still a difficulty here. And that is, if the Torah wants to teach a tzivui, the Torah is teaching us a tzivui over here. You can't tear the me'il. Why is the tzivui only hinted to by not writing Shelo Yikareya? That's how we're teaching a tzivui. By hinting to it and not writing Shelo Yikareya. A tzivui has to be written clearly and openly. You can't hint to a tzivui. A tzivui is something which is important. It should be written clearly. Therefore, Rashi continues and explains, Shazem Minin Lav and Shabbatera. What is Rashi saying here? He's answering this question. Why isn't the tzivui being written openly? Rashi is explaining that Lo Yikareya is also teaching us a lav, is not in order to teach us the actual isser that a person may not tear the me'il, because that has to be written openly and clearly. It's not teaching us the actual isser, because as we'll explain, we already know of this isser from another place. But rather, why is it telling it to us over here? It's in order that it should be in the count of the lavin. That it's usser we know, so it doesn't have to be written clearly. So then why is it saying it's a lav? Because it should be in the count of the lavin, meaning that the pasuk wants to calculate the already known isser in the total number of 365 lavin, and therefore it also has to have the meaning of a lav. And since that's the only reason, therefore it it's okay that it's only hinted to. So in other words, Rashi now is addressing a question. How could you write a lav only through a hint? A lav has to be written openly and clearly. So Rashi says, it's not telling us the lav over here. We know the lav. We know that this is forbidden. It's only being written over here as a lav because it wants to count it as one of the lavin. It's not in order to teach it. It's in order that it should be counted as a lav. Now, what's the source of the actual isur to tear the me'il? So this is understood simply from a previous pasuk where it says, "Vasisa bigdei kodesh la'aron achicha lechaved ulusifaris." It has to be lechaved ulusifaris, and a torn garment is not lechaved ulusifaris. However, we can also ask on this. We're still not done. We're not done. There's still a difficulty over here, which is we find in a number of places where the Torah adds a lav in order to laver all of Bishnei lavin. The Torah makes two lavin about something that there should be more severe, and nevertheless they're all written. They're written as a clear tzivui, each one of them. If so, here as well, there should be a clear tzivui that a person may not tear the me'il, because it's only through this that it becomes a lav. And like we see when the Torah says even two lavin on something, already you have one lav, it wants to add another one, it says the lav clearly. So even if we already know the Isser, but now it's being said as a lav, it should be written clearly also. So Rashi addresses this by writing shezemi minyan lavin shebatera and not vizemi minyan lavin shebatera. What's Rashi saying shezeh? This means to say that shezemi minyan lavin shebatera is the very reason why hakere over balav. The only reason a person is over balav is only because it is minyan lavin shebatera. What do we mean over here? In other words, when the Torah adds lavin, usually it's in order to make the person feel that the Isser is very severe, in order to make it easier for the person to hold back from doing the Isser. That's the purpose of making many lavin about something. It's to encourage and strengthen the person to do the right thing. However, the reason over here that akera over balav, the whole reason is not in order to make the person feel that the Isser is severe, but rather it's only because the Torah wants to count it in minyan lavin. And it's only as a result of this that akera over balav. So when do we write an Isser openly? If it's teaching it to us, it's not teaching us here. We already know it. It also should write it openly if it wants to strengthen the Isser. It's not looking to strengthen it here. It's only saying it in order to be able to count it as one of the lavin. And since the lav is not taught to make the person feel that the Isser is severe, it's only in order that it should be counted in the lavin. So therefore, it's enough if it's just hinted to. And this also explains why Rashi changes from the wording in the Gemara. The Gemara says, "I'm a kareya bigdekuna loike." Rashi says, "Over balav." Why? Because the goal in the Gemara is to show how severe it is, to get malchus. Rashi's goal is to minimize it. It's just wants it to be a lav, in order that to tell us, as Rashi continues, that it's only in order to count it as a lav. So Rashi is not coming here to emphasize that the person who tears the meal gets malchus, but rather that it's a lav. And as he continues to say, and the only reason it's even mentioning it is because it wants to count it as a lav, but not in order to make the avera severe. Now we're going to move on to explain the last part of Rashi, where Rashi says, "V'chein v'lo yizach ha'choshen v'chein lo yisuru menu hanemer bebadei ha'oren." So up to now we understand Rashi. Rashi tells us, since it says lo yikareya, so it can be a regular tzivui, because the implication is that other things could be done through others. So rather, it's kadesh lo yikareya. Why doesn't it say shel lo yikareya? Because because there's also a lav. The Torah is also teaching us here that there's a lav. Then the question is, why would the Torah teach us a lav in such a way that it's only hinted to? And the answer to that is that it's only being taught over here as a lav because it's from the minyan lavin. It's one of the lavin. It's not that we're learning it over here for the first time. We already know about this Isser. We know that it's not allowed to be done from elsewhere. And it's not even being said to make it a severe Isser. It's only in order to count it as a lav. So we understand up to here in Rashi. However, it's still not completely glatt. All the questions are answered. But even if all questions are answered, it doesn't mean that it works well. There's no questions on this, but it just doesn't sound right. Which is why specifically here does the Torah add a lav just in order that it should be counted in the minyan lavin. It's a very strange thing. We're saying that's written it's only hinted to because the Torah just wants to count it as a lav. It's not looking to make it severe. It just wants to have this in one of the lavin without anything more to it. It's a very strange thing. It's something out of the ordinary. Why over here specifically do we find this? So therefore Rashi continues and explains, Where in these lavin, there is nothing new in the actual Isser itself. Because we already know that, we'll see in a moment, we already know that these things have to be done. And so we see from here that the Torah wants to add in lavin by the Mlechas HaMishkan. How do we know these things already before V'lo Yizach and Lo Yasuru? By the Choshen it says, V'yirkasu es HaChoshen, b'psilt chelis, liyes al chesha ve'efed. And Rashi explains that it means liyes al choshen davuk al chesha ve'efed. So that the Choshen should be attached and touching the chesha ve'efed. So we already know that the Choshen has to be touching the efed. And so too by the Badei Aaron, it says right at the beginning of that pasuk, we have a clear tzivui, b'tabaris ha'aron yu ha'badim. And therefore, from this, that the Torah adds the lavin of V'lo Yizach and Lo Yasuru Mimenu. So we have a proof that the Torah wants to add lavin by the Mishkan and by the Bigdei Kuna. And so now it's easier to understand that the Torah writes Lo Yikareya and not Shelo Yikareya, just in order to add in the number, to add a lav, that it should be counted as one of the lavin. You see, the Torah does this by other things in the Mishkan and the Bigdei Kuna. So now we understand the whole Rashi. Why Rashi says the first thing he says that it's Kedei Shaloi Yikareya, and why he adds that it's a lav, because it doesn't say Shaloi, and then the rest of it, how he's coming to explain that a lav is being taught over here and written over here in a way that it's only hinted to and not clearly. And Rashi addresses all of that in the rest of his teaching, where he says Shazem Minin Lavin and V'chein by the Choshen and the Aron. And with that, we answered all of the questions. Now we're going to move on to the Inyanim of Floim and Halacha in this Rashi and the Yeina Shel Torah in this Rashi. So starting with the Inyanim of Floim. From the Inyanim of Floim and Halacha in this Rashi, the Rambam rules that a Kireya Pia Me'il Loika, someone who tears the opening at the top of the meal, gets Malkus. Shenemar, for it says in the Pasuk, Lo Yikareya, it should not be torn. V'hu Adin L'chol Bigdei Kuhuna. The same is the halacha for all of the bigdei kuna. Sha'akayran derech hashchasa loika, that someone that tears them in a way of destruction gets malchus. Now, from the simple understanding of this teaching in the Rambam, it comes out that there's a difference between all the other bigdei kuna and the me'il. Because by all the other bigdei kuna, a person only gets malchus if they do it derech hashchasa, like Rashi says, like the Rambam says, sha'akayran derech hashchasa. However, a kairea pia me'il loika, no matter how it's done. Now, the Achronim explained this ruling of the Rambam as follows. The reason one who tears all the other bigdei kuna gets malchus is because of the lav of loy sasun kein lashem alekechem. It says in the pasuk in Chumash Dvarim what should be done with the things of Avodah Zarah lahavdil, and then it concludes loy sasun kein lashem alekechem. And so from there we learn the halacha about one who tears all the bigdei kuna that they get malchus, and that lav over there is only if it's done derech hashchasa. Whereas by the me'il, a person gets malchus because of the lav of lo yikareya. And for that lav, a person gets malchus no matter how it's done. It doesn't say only derech hashchasa. Now, according to Rashi, that the pasuk only adds lo yikareya in order that it should be in the minyan lavin, but not to add any iser. So then it comes out that there shouldn't be any difference between the me'il and all the other bigdei kuna, because this pasuk is not adding anything whatsoever. That's why it's only hinted to. So not only is it not adding in the severity, it's also not adding that it can't be done in any manner. If the starting point is that it's derech hashchasa without this pasuk is not adding anything. So that means the me'il is like all the other bigdei kuna according to Rashi, and a person only gets malchus if they tear it in a way of derech hashchasa. Now we're going to move on to and conclude with the Yeina Shel Torah, and we're going to do it in two parts because it's long. From the Yeina Shel Torah in this teaching of Rashi, in Pnimmis Yonim, it's not understood why Rashi brings the proof from V'lo Yizach HaChoshen, which is an hour parsha, before the proof from Lo Yasuru by the Aron, which is from the previous parsha. Rashi, it would seem, should first bring Lo Yasuru, which is from Parshas Truma, and then afterwards Lo Yizach, which is from our parsha. And also another difficulty over here is, why does Rashi add the word v'chein? Rashi says v'chein v'lo yizach ha'choshen, v'chein lo yasur mimenu hanemer bebadei ha'aron. Why does he say v'chein twice? You could just say v'chein v'lo yizach ha'choshen, v'lo yasur mimenu hanemer bebadei ha'aron. Why does he write the word v'chein a second time? So from this it's understood that the lav of lo yasuru is another chiddush and a greater chiddush than the lav of v'lo yizach. So the reason Rashi is bringing it in this order is because the lav of lo is a bigger chiddush. So Rashi first says our pasuk, then it says v'chein v'lo yizach, and then even more lo yasuru, and therefore Rashi says it after v'lo yizach and says v'chein a second time. Rashi wants to emphasize it's also by the choshen, not only in our pasuk, also by the choshen, and even more also by the aron. By saying also and bringing it second, he's emphasizing that it's a bigger chiddush. It's a whole separate chiddush. So you have to say also there. What's the explanation in this? The explanation of this is as follows. The lav of lo yikareya is not a great chiddush, because it's understood that a person is not allowed to ruin the big day kuna. It's a simple idea. You can't tear the big day kuna. So afterwards Rashi says, v'chein v'lo yizach, also moving the choshen from the ephod, even though nothing is being ruined, is a lav. However, so it's a bigger chiddush because nothing's being ruined. So it's a bigger chiddush that it's still a lav. However, we can also understand this, like the pasuk over there by the choshen continues and says, "V'nasa Aaron shmeis bnei Yisrael b'choshen hamishpat al libay lizikaron lifnei Hashem tamid." It serves a purpose, so it can't become loose, it can't be moved from its place. However, the reason for b'tabayis Aaron yu abadim lo yasur mimenu seems to be completely not understood. The badei Aaron were there in order to carry the Aaron from place to place. So why do they always have to be there? To the contrary, on a simple level, they should only be placed in the rings when the Aron had to be moved, because that's their whole purpose. Therefore, Rashi says, "V'chein v'lo yasur mimenu hanemer b'badei Aron," to teach that this too is a lav, and exactly the same type of lav as tearing the big day kuna. Now, what's indeed the reason for this? That the badei Aron have to always be there, and it's so severe. So the Chinuch explains, "Nitztavinu lebal nasir badei Aron." We were commanded not to remove the badim, the poles from the aron, because maybe we will need to go out with the aron to a certain place and we'll have to go quickly. And maybe because of the rush, we won't check properly to make sure that they're placed inside well. But when they're there and always prepared, so if they're always prepared and they're never going to be removed, so then they'll be made properly when they're put in initially at the first time. So that's the reason for it. And now we're going to move on to see what we could learn from this. What's the Yenel Shel Torah in this Rashi over here, bringing down the order that tearing the Me'il is alive, and even moving the Choshen is alive, and even not having the Badim, taking out the Badim by the Aron, from the rings, that too is a lav, all on the same level. What's the Yenel Shel Torah that we could take from here? From here we have a Hayra Nifla in the Avodah of each and every one. The Luchas were in the Aron, which they are the inyan of Torah. As the Chinuch says, Ha'aron Mishkan HaTorah. The Aron is the place of the Torah. Also a Yid who learns Torah is similar to the Aron, because such a Yid is a Mishkan HaTorah. So a Yid can think to themselves during the time that's devoted to learning Torah, and especially if by this Yid it's Torah Soyim Nasei, so during that time they must be totally devoted to learning, and they have to be removed from everything around them. During those times, what place is there to think about anything else? What place is there to think even about another Yid? And so from here we have a Hira from the Badei Aron. Even when the Aron was in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the holiest place in the world, even then the Badim must be Muchanim La'elam. They always have to be prepared in order to be able to bring it b'mehirus, quickly to the place it has to go. And even more so, removing the Badim from the rings has the same severity as tearing and ruining the big day kuna. And similarly by the Torah. No matter how much a Yid is immersed in learning Torah, a Yid must always be ready to bring Torah whenever and wherever it's needed, and specifically in a matter of mehirus to another Yid and another Yid.